Hello, everyone. No one of consequence here with another episode of my Give the People What They Want series. Several weeks ago, I came across this article while browsing around for D&D related news. Actually, it's more like a blog post. I bookmarked it, but I didn't do anything further because I'd already made a video about the person named. However, that was a long time ago, probably 1.5 years. I've gained a lot of new subscribers since then, and I also realize that when people sub to a channel, they typically don't go back and watch old content. I'm guilty of that myself. So I finally decided that maybe I should go back and revisit this topic after all. To begin with, these are only the first few lines of a very long article. I'll post a link in the description if you want to read the whole thing. Anyway, let's get started. Ben Riggs is engaging in slander. He is a fraud and a charlatan, and he's not the only one. Ben Riggs, a self-proclaimed Dungeons & Dragons historian, is defrauding people. He's just one in a coordinated effort to extract money or worse through fraudulent scholarship. Even the people that were there have spoken up. I don't like his historical revisionism. Now, in case you don't know, Ben Riggs wrote this book, Slaying the Dragon, and it was published in 2022. A lot of people liked it, some people didn't. I personally have not read it, but his book is not the topic of this video. What I do want to talk about is a series of posts that Ben Riggs made on X back in 2024 and early 2025. D&D co-creator Gary Gygax was sexist. Talking about it is key to preserving his legacy. Damn right I'm sexist. It doesn't matter to me if women get paid as much as men. They can jolly well stay away from wargaming in droves for all I care. Gary Gygax, 1975. And this is what Riggs is talking about. This statement by Gygax appeared in the Europa News Scene, number 10/11, in August-September of 75. Gygax starts by saying, "I have been accused of being a nasty old sexist male chauvinist pig, for the wording in D&D isn't what it should be." Then skipping ahead, we get to the part that Ben Riggs quoted. "Damn right I'm sexist. It doesn't matter to me if women get paid as much as men, get jobs traditionally male, and shower in the men's locker room. They can jolly well stay away from wargaming in droves for all I care. I've seen many a good wargame and wargamer spoiled thanks to the fair sex. I'll detail that if anyone wishes." But researching this topic caused me to ask myself, what prompted Gary Gygax to send that statement to the Europa News Scene in the first place? Well, the answer can be found here, in issue number 6-8, published in April of 75. The publisher asks, "Why are women so uninvolved in wargaming? One of the reasons I feel wargaming is frowned upon by some lies in its very nature, the glorification of war and killing." Now, he actually wrote a lot more in relation to that question, much more than I have time to address here. However, PDFs of Europa are available for downloading from the Internet Archive. Just search on the guy's name, Walter Luke Hawes. You really should take a look at this news scene if you're interested in the early history of the hobby. You will quickly realize that this publication was a labor of love by the guy who created it. At any rate, as you can see here, the writer closes by inviting readers to submit their own comments on this question about women in wargaming. He says, "I am always open to comments and/or questions. I also hope to receive some feedback on the topics discussed and approach to game reviews that I have taken for Europa." Now, reader replies were not compiled and published until issue 10/11 in August-September of 75. And in the introduction to the section in which Gygax's comment appears, the publisher wrote this. "Jack Green and his girlfriend's notes about women in wargaming caused a huge amount of replies. Approximately 10% of you commented it. Reason enough to quote at least parts of your comments." Now, I underline that one segment on purpose, where he says at least parts, because I believe it is particularly relevant. And more importantly, the publisher wrote this. "The huge amount of comments forces me to edit heavily. Sorry." So, When we read the published comment from Gygax, are we getting the full picture of what he actually sent in? Who knows? Does the original and complete document still exist somewhere in Switzerland? Or did Gygax retain a copy for himself, which might still exist somewhere in his papers? Again, who knows? Could it be that the publisher printed only the most sensationalistic part of a larger document, which would have otherwise put everything Gygax said into context? Well, surely not. That's never happened before in the entire history of journalism. Now, I do realize that everything I'm saying here might be a bit of a stretch. However, it must still be acknowledged that we may not be seeing everything that Gygax actually submitted to this publication in its full context. It was already established by this time that Gygax loved to write about games, and Dungeons & Dragons in particular. Search through other issues of Europa, and you'll see what I mean. Gygax was a prolific contributor. Therefore, I find it difficult to believe that this single paragraph comprises the entirety of what Gygax actually submitted on this particular occasion. Meanwhile, jumping ahead to today, Frank Mincer tells us, one quote, "Damn right I'm sexist," was a deliberate poke to get a response, not a sexist in reality, in behavior, or belief. Another ill-considered, humorous, angry jab. Frank also wrote, as to infamous quotes now being widely publicized, all taken out of context and milked for clicks. You ever exaggerate to make a point or play the clown to amuse others? Now, Frank Mincer knew and worked with Gygax for decades. And since Gary is no longer around to defend himself, I am prepared to listen to those who were closest to him at the time, rather than those who probably weren't even born back then. I searched around in other issues of Europa, looking for anything else Gygax submitted, which might be of interest to this video. What I found was mostly him talking about either D&D's development or explaining how the game is played. However, I did clip this one paragraph from a larger submission of his, which appeared in issue number 3, November 1974. Gygax wrote, "Furthermore, fantasy wargames, D&D specifically, seem to be excellent vehicles for bringing wargamers together, finding new recruits, and actually interesting those who would not otherwise be interested in wargaming in that aspect of our hobby. It has worked that way everywhere." So as you can see, far from wishing to exclude anyone, even at this early date, Gygax was already expressing the hope that Dungeons & Dragons would actually increase participation in the gaming hobby as a whole. To elaborate on that point, in June 1979, Gygax wrote this. The target audience to which we thought D&D would appeal was principally the same as that of historical wargames in general, and military miniatures in particular. D&D was hurriedly compiled, assuming that readers would be familiar with medieval and ancient history, wargaming, military miniatures, etc. It was aimed at males. So Gygax is admitting that during the game's development, he and the others wildly underestimated just who exactly the Dungeons & Dragons game would appeal to. He goes on to say, within a few months, it became apparent to us that our basic assumptions might be a bit off target. In another year, it became abundantly clear to us that we were so far off as to be laughable. At least we had the right subject material and the right general approach, so 2 out of 3 and all that. Again, Gygax is acknowledging that the game had a much broader appeal than they had originally anticipated, and he freely admits to their mistake. They were never intentionally trying to exclude anyone. They merely thought they were writing for what they assumed would be their core demographic. But later in the same article, Gygax goes on to explain the reasoning behind the creation of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. He says, the work addresses itself to a broad audience of hundreds of thousands of people. Wargamers, game hobbyists, science fiction and fantasy fans, those who have never read fantasy fiction or played strategy games, young and old, male and female. Emphasis mine, obviously. And with that, the claim that Gygax was sexist is beginning to look weak. Shifting gears now, let's talk about Jean Wells. She was the first female game designer to be hired by TSR. After some back and forth correspondence with Gary Gygax during the fall of 1978, she flew to TS headquarters in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin in January 79 for a 3-day visit. Despite her lack of experience, Gygax hired her as the first female in the design department. So, in 1979, the supposedly sexist Gary Gygax hired a woman with almost no gaming experience to work in the TSR design department. Moving on, she was the inaugural author of Sage Advice, a D&D advice column that first appeared in The Dragon, starting with issue number 31 in November of 79. So again, the supposedly sexist Gary Gygax gave this woman her own column in Dragon magazine. And the first thing she did with that column was to solicit input from female Dungeons & Dragons players. Gene Wells, a member of the design department at TSR Hobbies, is preparing an article for The Dragon on women in D&D. I want to know what women players feel, think, and enjoy about D&D, says Gene. What are the ups and downs for them? What do they think they have added to the game? And the results of that research appeared in Dragon number 39 in July 1980. Needless to say, in those days, nothing would have appeared in Dragon magazine without Gary Gygax's approval. So, in summary, everything that I've shown you up to this point should be enough to debunk Ben Rigg's claim that Gygax was sexist. Moving on to Rigg's next post on X. D&D is popular and important because it lets us tell stories to make meaning in our lives. It's good to remove racist, sexist tropes from D&D to make everyone welcome at the table. So I generally support the changes D&D 2024 made to this end. Now, in my opinion, this is just nonsense. Everyone always has been welcome at the table. I do not know how old Ben Riggs is, but he doesn't look that old, and I feel confident in saying that he was not playing the Dungeons & Dragons game back in the early days. However, I was playing the game back then, and so I think I'm qualified to speak about what it was like. Contrary to what Mr. Riggs seems to believe, even back then everyone was welcome at the game table. At various times, I played D&D with females, gays, blacks, Asians, the disabled, the neurodivergent, the body positive, you name it. And that was back during the very early 1980s, literally the dark ages of gaming to people like Ben Riggs. And yet, even then, everyone was welcome at the gaming table. Later on, when I was in college, I sometimes ran an open table D&D game in the dorm, and again, no one was ever turned away. Same thing after I joined the Army and ran a D&D game in the barracks. Anyone who expressed an interest was welcome to have a seat. And never once during any of those times did I ever hear anyone say, "Gee, I'd like to play Dungeons & Dragons, but I just don't feel represented in the game." The truth is, everyone has always been represented in the game. And no, I'm not talking about the early artwork. I'm talking about what really matters, the game itself. You have always been able to play your character exactly how you imagine them to be. But the key word here is imagine. You only needed to use your imagination. You didn't need the rule book to tell you that it was okay to be whomever you wanted to be. Everyone just intuitively understood that. And no one that I ever knew rejected the game because they didn't feel represented in the artwork. It just didn't happen, not in my experience anyway. One other thing to consider, this was back during the Satanic Panic years. Some people who might have otherwise played D&D were kept away from the game, or else they played it in secret and kept quiet about it outside of their own small circle of friends. Actually, a lot of people did that back then because the game wasn't considered cool like it is now, all of which made it even more difficult to find other players. You just didn't always know who you could trust. In light of all that, all we ever cared about was if you were interested in playing the game. If you were welcome, no matter who you were or what you looked like. What I don't need now is anyone lecturing me on how, quote, exclusionary the game was back then, and especially by someone who wasn't even around at the time. Anyway, moving on. A couple of days later, Ben Riggs posted this on X. Here's the drill entry for the first edition Monster Manual. Drow, black elves, are only legend. They purportedly dwell deep beneath the surface in a strange subterranean realm. The Drow are said to be as dark as fairies are bright, and as evil as the latter are good. A dark-skinned race of evil blacks? Certainly, the changes to the Drow in 2024 D&D were needed. And someone is going to say that the Drow are simply the Svartalfar, or Black Elves from Norse mythology, which was indeed a source, but they weren't evil in Norse mythology. Now, I admit I am no scholar on Norse mythology, so I asked ChatGPT about it, and this is what it said. Nearly everything we know about Norse elves comes from the Prose Edda, written by Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson around 1220, preserving much older oral traditions. The most famous passage describes two types of elves. There are two kinds of elves. There are the light elves and the dark elves. The light elves are fairer than the sun to look upon, but the dark elves are blacker than pitch. This brief passage is one of the primary reasons later fantasy writers associated dark elves with the underground realms and darkness. Unfortunately, Snorri tells us almost nothing else about them. Were they evil? Not necessarily. Norse mythology doesn't divide supernatural creatures into strict good and evil categories. The Dark Elves are mysterious and associated with darkness and the underworld, but they are not depicted as an organized civilization bent on conquest. So, Ben Riggs states emphatically that Norse Black Elves were not evil. However, as you just saw, ChatGPT was a little more nuanced about the subject. So then I asked Grok about the same topic. It said, the Black Elves are sometimes depicted as more earthy or morally ambiguous than Light Elves. They are not always portrayed as outright evil in the myths, but they are tied to the subterranean world, craftsmanship sometimes, and a different nature from the good or light-aligned beings. Some interpretations see them as more akin to the undead or trickster figures in folklore. So again, a more nuanced definition than the cut-and-dried claim made by Ben Riggs. I don't really know what else to say to refute this, other than to add that black and darkness have always been associated with evil and danger. It is certainly nothing unique to the Dungeons & Dragons game. And the explanation for that association between darkness and evil is really very simple. Humans did not evolve eyesight that allows us to see well in the dark. Humans evolved as diurnal or day-active creatures. Therefore, we see poorly in the dark, and thus the nighttime has always brought an increased sense of vulnerability and danger, both to ourselves and in our pre-human ancestors. But you know what did evolve to see well in the dark? A whole host of apex predators with whom our human and pre-human ancestors had to coexist. Every one of these predators was quite capable of seeing and hunting during hours of darkness. This in turn led to a psychological pattern that became hardwired into our brains. Darkness equals the unknown, danger, unseen threats. Light equals safety, visibility, a certainty of our surroundings. It has nothing to do with morality or skin color. It is simply survival-based, and it transcends all races and cultures. And over the course of human history, these hardwired perceptions have carried over into our metaphors, our mythology and legends, and or storytelling. Anyway, Riggs ended the thread by saying, removing automatically evil Drow from 2024 D&D was a great decision. Because that's the nature of the Dungeons & Dragons games these days, isn't it? No race, or species if you prefer, is inherently good or evil. Bottom line is, every non-human anthropomorphic creature in Dungeons & Dragons is now just another human in a skin suit. Moving on to the next tweet from Ben Riggs. Ever notice how Loth, the chaotic evil queen of the spiders, goddess to the all-evil Black Elves, looks African-American on the cover of 1986's Queen of the Spiders? Again, D&D links dark skin, African features to evil, so the changes in 2024 D&D were very much needed. So this is really just a continuation from his previous line of posts. This is the source of the artwork that Riggs is referring to, the cover illustration for the super module Queen of the Spiders. Now, in this particular case, I actually agree with him. I do not like the way the drow are depicted here either. But that's only because Gary Gygax originally described their skin as being jet black and not this shade of brown. The drow first appeared in this adventure module, Hall of the Fire Giant King, published in 1978. In it, the drow are described as black-skinned and pale-haired. Male drow have dead black skin and dead white hair. Females have glossy black skin and shining silvery hair. However, when the drow were codified in the Fiend Folio in 1981, the description was shortened to read, "Drow are black-skinned and pale-haired." So anyway, yes, I actually agree with Ben Riggs on this particular topic, but not for the reason he would like. I much prefer these older depictions of the drow as opposed to that cover art on the Queen of the Spiders module. Back to his tweet on the topic. In my opinion, he is simply projecting racism where none exists, just so he can make himself look good by calling it out. Now, on the original video I made about this topic, someone replied with this comment. Regarding the Queen of the Spiders being black, a friend posted on X some possible inspiration for the cover. 1980 CBS TV special Linda Carter Encore, during which Wonder Woman sings a rendition of I Was Made for Loving You by Kiss after descending from a spider web. Now, I had never heard this before, so I had to look into it. Details were rather difficult to come by, but here are some search results. An ad in the TV guide for that week, and a screen grab from a commercial promoting it. I'm a little surprised that the TV guide ad doesn't mention Kiss as appearing on the show, because in 1980 they were huge. I don't remember if I even saw this program when it was broadcast. I would have been about 15 years old at the time. But if I did see it, I've long since forgotten about it. Now, if you're really interested, you can go on YouTube and watch the actual performance. But the important point for us here is how Linda Carter first enters for the routine. Sorry, these images are a little blurry. They are screenshots from an old television program. But you can clearly see Linda Carter's outfit and the spider web prop behind her. And when you compare these two images side by side, it's hard to deny the resemblance. It could just be a coincidence, but I don't really think so. There are just too many similarities. And of course, everybody borrows from everybody. Moving on to the next day's tweet by Ben Riggs. Are you aware of the harlot table from the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide? Yes, Ben. Anyone except the most casual of D&D players is probably aware of the harlot table. Apparently, Gary Gygax just wanted to let everyone know precisely what kind of prostitutes one might encounter in D&D. No wonder D&D had trouble attracting female players for so long. So, just to illustrate what Ben is talking about, here it is. In the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, there is a table which the DM can use to determine random encounters for the characters while they are in an urban environment. And one of those results is harlot. And that entry has a subtable upon which the DM can roll. Now, when you read through these results, any reasonable person would conclude that tongue was firmly planted in cheek when Gygax wrote this. I mean, just look at all the descriptive terms. Gygax could not have seriously intended for the DM to roleplay the difference between a, quote, expensive doxy and a, quote, haughty courtesan. And in fact, Frank Mincer said this about the topic. In the DMG, we find the harlots table. That was a joke. Again, Frank was there when all this was going down, so I think he would know the behind-the-scenes mindset at the time. Meanwhile, one of the commenters in my original video said this. The harlot table is obviously a joke. else we would have proper game statistics for a slovenly troll versus an expensive doxy. LOL. Now, he's being humorous here, but he does make a good point. The first edition Dungeon Master's Guide is absolutely cram-packed with detailed information, covering a wide array of subjects, which is why it's such a valuable game reference even today, and even if you don't play first edition AD&D. And if that harlot table was meant to be taken seriously, it probably would have included a lot more detail than it actually does. Elsewhere in that same Facebook post, Frank also said this: I think Gary's morals and ethics were notably superior. He worked to be fair, regardless of age, sex, beliefs, or whatever. I recall him hiring and defending Gene Wells, and later acquiring Barima Obong Ubusu for VP Finance at TSR. Sometimes he got mad, sure. Sometimes he said things he regretted, sure. His was a normal, smart, deep human mind, kind and considerate, a Jehovah's Witness and flawed. I knew him well, friends for over 25 years. You can see the truth in the above. Again, I'm more prepared to accept the opinions of someone who actually knew and worked with Gary Gygax than those of some game historian who wasn't even around at the time. I have to say, though, if the harlot table gets Ben Riggs in such a twist, let's hope he never discovers this alternate character class from White Dwarf magazine number 13. In the meantime, Ben Riggs remains unrepentant of all of this. As of this video's recording, these posts all remain visible on his X account. Anyway, let's close out by going back to that article from the beginning of this video. The writer says he, Ben Riggs, has made up issues to be offended by because he couldn't find enough. And I think that sums up things pretty well. Alright, well that's all for now. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button. If you can, leave a comment and let me know what you think. Engagement helps. If you haven't yet, please consider subscribing to the channel. And anything you do to help support the channel, I appreciate it. Thanks again. Bye for now.